Right now, seismologists throughout the San Francisco Bay Area are tracking two distinct but closely linked developments that emerged within days of one another. A cluster of earthquake activity that just shook the East Bay along a fault tied directly into the San Andreas system. And a brand new piece of geological research indicating the San Andreas Fault itself may be capable of generating major earthquakes far more frequently than scientists had previously assumed. On its own, either story would merit attention. Together, surfacing in the same week, they've pushed the Bay Area's seismic risk profile back into the scientific spotlight in a way it hasn't seen in years. Today, we'll walk through exactly what happened during this latest swarm, why its location and depth carry so much weight, what the newly released San Andreas research actually revealed, and what seismologists say they're specifically watching for as both of these stories continue to develop. Before we dig in, if you're after a clear, level-headed rundown of California earthquake science rather than a sensational headline, go ahead and subscribe now since we follow developments like this closely as fresh data and research continue to arrive. Leave a comment below letting us know whether you felt this particular swarm yourself, since thousands of people across the Bay Area reported shaking, and those first-hand accounts genuinely add depth beyond what the instrument readings alone can show. And if this explanation helps you make sense of a story that's easy to either brush off or overreact to, sharing it helps more people get the accurate version instead. No dramatizing here, just the facts and the science. Let's get into it. The activity kicked off on the morning of Thursday, August 13th, 2026 at 8:30 a.m. Pacific Time when the United States Geological Survey logged an earthquake centered roughly 2.5 miles north of San Leandro near the Oakland Zoo at a shallow depth of just over 3 meters beneath the surface. The initial automated reading pegged the magnitude at 4.1, a figure that spread rapidly across news alerts and social media in the minutes right after the shaking. As USGS seismologists reviewed the incoming seismic data more thoroughly over the following hour, that estimate was revised downward first to 3, 9, then to a final confirmed magnitude of 3.8. Two smaller aftershocks followed within the next 40 minutes. A magnitude 3.0 event and a magnitude 2.8 event, both centered in nearly the same spot just north of San Leandro, near the Oakland-San Leandro border. Despite its relatively modest final magnitude, the earthquake was felt across an extraordinarily wide geographic range for an event of that size, with confirmed reports of shaking stretching from Santa Rosa in the north all the way to Santa Cruz in the south and as far east as Sacramento, spanning cities including Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, Fremont, Livermore, Concord, Pleasanton, Petaluma, Walnut Creek, Pacifica, and Half Moon Bay along the coast. That unusually broad felt area ties directly back to the depth of the rupture. And it's worth unpacking the physics behind that connection because it reveals something genuinely important about how earthquake damage potential actually works. When an earthquake occurs at a shallow depth, its seismic energy has to pass through far less rock and soil before reaching the surface compared to a deeper earthquake of identical magnitude. Meaning that shallow energy loses far less strength along the way and produces more intense ground motion across a wider surrounding area. A follow-up analysis from researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory examining the specific event found that the shallow depth of the August 13th rupture meant the resulting shaking was roughly 50% stronger than what an equivalent magnitude earthquake occurring at a more typical depth would have produced. That single detail explains a great deal about why an earthquake technically classified by the USGS as merely weak to light in intensity still managed to rattle residents across such a wide stretch of Northern California, and why local transit officials weren't taking any chances with it. One resident interviewed by a local television station near the fault's edge in San Leandro described the sensation memorably, likening the shaking to being inside a large bowl of gelatin, and said the experience briefly left her wondering whether something far more serious was underway. A reaction that offers a genuine human sense of just how disproportionate this earthquake's impact felt relative to its modest official magnitude. BART, the region's rail transit system, put precautionary train slowdowns into effect immediately following the shaking, a standard protocol response that includes track inspections before service can safely resume at normal speed. That protocol carries particular weight for this specific fault because BART's Berkeley Hills tunnel physically bores directly through the Hayward Fault itself, a well-documented engineering vulnerability that has shaped how the transit agency designs its earthquake response procedures for exactly this kind of scenario. One detail from the morning that caught many residents off guard was the complete absence of a shake alert notification on their phones. Angie Lux, a project scientist working on the early warning system at UC Berkeley's Seismological Laboratory, explained to local media that the system had in fact registered the earthquake in real time exactly as designed, but that shake alert is specifically configured to push public notifications only once an event crosses a magnitude 4.5 threshold. Because this earthquake's confirmed magnitude settled at 3.8, 8 safely below that automatic alert threshold, even accounting for the initial higher preliminary estimate. No public warning was ever triggered, leaving residents to experience the shaking with no advance notice whatsoever. The fault responsible for this swarm is the Hayward Fault, and understanding exactly where it sits within the broader San Andreas system is essential to understanding why seismologists took this particular event so seriously despite its modest magnitude. The Hayward Fault runs roughly parallel to the San Andreas itself, tracing a path directly beneath one of the most densely populated corridors in the entire Bay Area. Running from San Pablo Bay in the north down through Berkeley, Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward, and continuing toward Fremont in the south. It functions as a major branch within the same broader system of faults created by the ongoing grinding motion between the Pacific and North American tectonic plates, the same underlying tectonic engine that powers the San Andreas Fault itself. Geologically, the Hayward is part of what researchers call the East Bay Fault System, a network that also includes the Calaveras Fault further inland. All 3 faults absorbing a share of the same overall plate boundary motion that the San Andreas carries the larger portion of further to the west. A kind of shared workload spread across several parallel fracture lines, rather than concentrated entirely on one single fault trace. The Hayward Fault last produced a genuinely major earthquake in 1868, an event significant enough in its own era that it was for decades afterward actually referred to by many Californians as the state's original great earthquake, before the far more famous 1906 San Francisco earthquake along the San Andreas eventually eclipsed it in public memory. The 1868 rupture destroyed a significant portion of the town of Hayward, then a much smaller settlement than the sprawling city that exists in that location today, and it was strong enough to be felt as far away as the Central Valley. That means the Hayward Fault has now gone more than a century and a half without releasing a comparable amount of accumulated stress, a gap that geoasicists specifically flagged as concerning even before this week's swarm occurred, particularly given how dramatically the population living directly along the fault's trace has grown since the 19th century from a scattered handful of rural communities into one of the most continuously built-up urban corridors anywhere on the West Coast. A team from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory issued a direct assessment following this latest activity, stating plainly that the fault is overdue for an earthquake that could cause extensive damage to such a dense population zone. That assessment isn't a new or sudden conclusion prompted purely by this week's swarm. It builds on years of prior research, including detailed computer simulations run by scientists at both Livermore and UC Berkeley that modeled exactly how a magnitude 7 to 7.1 earthquake along the Hayward Fault would actually unfold, tracing a rupture beginning south of Fremont and tearing 50 miles northwest towards San Pablo Bay. Those simulations found that the most severe ground shaking from such an event would occur precisely in the East Bay cities running directly along the fault's trace, with significant motion also extending across the San Francisco Peninsula and into southern Marin County. And researchers involved in that broader body of work have consistently described the Hayward as the single most dangerous fault in the entire Bay Area, specifically because of how directly it runs beneath such a large concentration of homes, schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure. Geoasicist Stephen Burns, who has been tracking this week's activity closely, offered an important clarification about how seismologists actually interpret a swarm like this one in real time, rather than simply reacting to any single earthquake in isolation. As of this week, he characterized the Hayward Fault's activity as remaining within normal parameters, the kind of background seismicity that occurs periodically along active fault systems without necessarily signaling that a larger event is imminent. But he was equally direct about what would change that assessment, explaining that if researchers began observing more pronounced swarming behavior, specifically multiple magnitude 4.0 or larger earthquakes striking along the Hayward Fault in the same location or nearby in rapid succession, that would represent a meaningfully different and more concerning pattern. One suggesting something larger might genuinely be building beneath the surface. That distinction between routine background activity and a genuinely escalating pattern is exactly the kind of nuance that separates careful scientific monitoring from reflexive alarm, and it's precisely the threshold seismologists are now watching for as this week continues to unfold. It's worth pausing here to explain the broader scientific concept of an earthquake swarm itself, because it behaves in ways that are genuinely different from the earthquake sequences most people are more familiar with. A typical earthquake sequence follows what's called a main shock aftershock pattern. A single large earthquake followed by a series of progressively smaller aftershocks that gradually decay in both frequency and magnitude over the following days and weeks, following a fairly predictable mathematical curve that seismologists can model with real confidence. A swarm behaves differently. There's no single dominant main shock driving the sequence. Instead, you get a cluster of earthquakes of broadly similar size occurring close together in time and location. And critically, that activity doesn't necessarily decay the way a standard aftershock sequence would be expected to. Swarms have shown up repeatedly across California's fault systems in recent years, including a well-documented sequence south of the Salton Sea earlier this year, centered in an area geologists refer to as the Broly Seismic Zone, wedged directly between the southern end of the San Andreas Fault and the Imperial Fault. Researchers monitoring that particular swarm noted an interesting structural detail worth understanding here too. That swarms in the Broly area tend to align perpendicular to the two major faults bounding the zone, suggesting there may be additional less obvious fault structure connecting the two systems beneath the surface that isn't fully mapped yet. Experts tracking that swarm also confirmed there remains a non-zero, though currently low probability that seismic activity in a connected zone like Broly could eventually transfer stress onto the San Andreas Fault itself. Precisely the kind of cross-fault interaction that makes seismologists reluctant to treat any single swarm as fully isolated from the broader fault network surrounding it. That's not the only recent example either. Earlier this summer, a swarm broke out near the small desert town of Johannesburg within the Eastern California shear zone, a complicated network of faults running through the Mojave Desert that has remained noticeably more active in the years since the major 2019 ridge arrest earthquakes. A sequence that began with a magnitude 6.444 shock on the 4th of July before escalating into a magnitude 7.1 main shock the following day, at the time the strongest earthquake to hit California in 2 decades. That 2019 sequence ruptured a complex web of previously unmapped faults across the shear zone rather than a single clean fault trace, and it fundamentally changed how researchers model stress transfer through that entire region, which is exactly why newer swarms in the same general area continue to draw close monitoring rather than being dismissed as routine. Zooming out across the state as a whole, California has recorded roughly 500 earthquakes of magnitude, 2.5 or greater so far this year alone, a pace that sits in line with or slightly above the state's recent historical average, underscoring that swarm activity itself is a normal and expected feature of living on top of an active plate boundary, even when any single instance of it draws heightened attention because of its specific location or timing. Now, layered directly on top of this week's Hayward Fault activity is a separate and in some ways even more significant development. New geological research suggesting the San Andreas Fault itself may be considerably more active than scientists previously understood, at least along one specific and critically important stretch of it. Kim Blisnook, a professor of geology at San Jose State University, who specializes in earthquake geology, has spent recent years studying the section of the northern San Andreas Fault that runs directly beneath the Santa Cruz Mountains, just south of the Bay Area. Her research focuses on measuring what geologists call the fault's slip rate, essentially the speed at which the two sides of the fault are grinding past each other over time, a figure with direct and significant implications for how frequently a given section of fault is likely to produce earthquakes. As Blisnook explained it directly, faults with higher slip rates generally produce more frequent earthquakes. And understanding that rate accurately gives scientists a genuine probability estimate for how often a major rupture is likely to occur along that specific stretch of fault. What makes Blisnook's findings genuinely significant is how they overturn a working assumption geologists had held for years about this particular section of the San Andreas. Prior research into the fault's slip rate in this exact area had been based on data spanning roughly 1,000 years of geological history, and that earlier work suggested the fault's speed actually slowed down as it continued south from the north coast section above San Francisco through the peninsula section running from south of the city down towards San Jose and finally into the Santa Cruz Mountain section further south. Still, one leading hypothesis for that apparent slowdown held that stress and movement were simply being redistributed, transferred off the main San Andreas trace and onto nearby parallel faults instead. Specifically, the Calaveras Fault and the very same Hayward Fault that had just produced this week's swarm. Blisnook's new research conducted at Sanborn County Park in Saratoga, where the San Andreas Fault runs directly beneath the park's terrain, extended that historical window dramatically, examining slip evidence preserved in the landscape across a full 10,000 years rather than the previous 1,000-year snapshot. Her findings, as she described them, show that the false slip rate along this Santa Cruz mountain stretch does not actually decrease the way earlier, shorter-term data had suggested. Instead, it appears to remain essentially constant across that entire 10,000-year window, matching the same rate documented further north along the fault's north coast section rather than tapering off as previously assumed. Blisnook explained the actual methodology behind that finding in fairly accessible terms, describing her work as measuring the rate at which the landform itself preserves a record of previous earthquakes along the fault. In practice, that means examining features like streams and drainage channels that cross directly over the fault trace. Since each time the fault ruptures, it physically offsets these channels sideways by a measurable amount. And by carefully dating the age of the surrounding sediment layers and measuring the cumulative sideways displacement built up over thousands of years, geologists can calculate an average slip rate considerably more precise than what shorter, more recent instrumental records alone could ever reveal. It's a method that essentially treats the landscape itself as a very slow, very durable seismograph, one that has been quietly recording the fault's activity for 10,000 years, long before any human instrument existed to measure it directly. The practical implication of that finding is straightforward, but genuinely consequential. A fault segment sitting directly south of one of the most densely populated metropolitan regions in the entire country may be capable of producing major earthquakes more frequently than the scientific community's prior working models accounted for. Blesnik framed the broader stakes of this kind of research in fairly direct human terms, drawing a comparison to insurance, something people purchase and maintain specifically because they hope never to actually need it, but that provides essential protection when the unexpected eventually does happen. She has been equally direct about the underlying reality Californians live with, regardless of any single new research finding, noting that residents of the state live directly on an active tectonic plate boundary. And that while people are often surprised when they hear about a major earthquake striking somewhere else in the world, California itself is not exempt from that same basic geological reality. And genuine preparedness matters precisely because of it. It's worth being clear about where this specific research currently stands within the broader scientific process. Blesnik's study has not yet been formally published in a peer-reviewed journal, and she has indicated she intends to present her full findings at a scientific conference this coming October, meaning the wider seismological community will have the opportunity to review, question, and potentially challenge or refine specific elements of the methodology and conclusions before the work becomes part of the fully established scientific record. That's an entirely normal and healthy part of how new geological research gets properly vetted, and it's worth keeping in mind as this particular finding continues generating attention. Considered together, this week's Hayward Fault swarm and Blesnik's new San Andreas slip rate findings don't actually describe the same fault, and it would be inaccurate to present them as a single unified discovery, but they reinforce the same broader picture from two independent angles. A regional fault system running directly beneath one of the most heavily populated corridors in the United States, still actively accumulating and periodically releasing tectonic stress on faults that in at least one specific case now appear capable of producing major earthquakes more often than previously modeled. That broader picture is entirely consistent with what regional seismic hazard assessments have already been telling residents for years through official government channels. According to hazard modeling that draws on the same USGS fault geometry used in the agency's own official earthquake forecasts, the San Francisco Bay region currently carries roughly a 72% probability of experiencing a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake on one of its major faults within the coming decades when all of the region's fault systems are considered together, while the greater Los Angeles region carries a comparable 60% probability under the same kind of combined assessment. Those aren't new numbers produced specifically in response to this week's news. They represent the ongoing, continuously updated consensus of California's seismic hazard modeling community. And this week's developments simply add fresh specific evidence to a risk picture that has already been well established for years. It's also worth putting the current moment in historical context, because the phrase overdue carries real scientific weight in seismology, even though it doesn't function the way the word might suggest in casual conversation. The San Francisco Bay Area has not experienced a genuinely major damaging earthquake since the magnitude 6.9 Lompria earthquake struck in October of 1989, an event that killed 63 people, caused billions of dollars in damage, and remains vivid in the memory of longtime Bay Area residents old enough to have lived through it, including at least one resident who, according to local reporting following this week's swarm, immediately wondered aloud whether the shaking she felt might signal something on that same historic scale beginning again. That's now closing in on 37 years without a comparable event striking the region, a gap that sits within but toward the longer end of the recurrence intervals seismologists generally associate with major Bay Area faults based on the historical earthquake record. Being overdue in a seismological sense doesn't mean an earthquake is guaranteed within any specific time frame. Fault behavior doesn't operate on a fixed, predictable schedule the way a scheduled maintenance interval does, but it does mean the accumulated stress along these fault systems has had an unusually long stretch of time to continue building without a major release, which is precisely the underlying condition that both this week's swarm and Blesnik's new slip rate research are drawing renewed attention to. It's worth remembering that LMA Praia itself, despite being the most recent major earthquake most Bay Area residents associate with the San Andreas system, didn't even rupture the section of fault running directly beneath the Bay Area's most densely populated cities. Its epicenter sat in the Santa Cruz Mountains, considerably further south along a segment of fault close to, though not identical to the very stretch Bliznik has now been studying in her new slip rate research. That means the fault segments running most directly beneath San Francisco, Oakland, and the rest of the immediate East Bay corridor, including both the northern San Andreas Trace itself and the Hayward Fault, a short distance to the east, have gone even longer than 37 years without releasing a comparable amount of accumulated stress. A detail that adds further weight to why officials continue treating both this week's developments as genuinely worth close attention rather than routine background noise. For broader context on what a truly major rupture along this system could look like, the USGS's own shakeout scenario, a detailed planning exercise built around a hypothetical magnitude 7.8 earthquake along the southern San Andreas Fault, has long served as the standard reference document California emergency planners use to estimate potential casualties, economic damage, and infrastructure disruption from an event of that scale, and it remains a foundational planning tool precisely because a rupture of comparable size along any major Bay Area fault, whether the San Andreas itself or a closely connected branch like the Hayward, would trigger broadly similar categories of consequence for the communities directly in its path. So what exactly are scientists watching for as both of these stories continue to develop? On the Hayward Fault specifically, the immediate monitoring priority is straightforward, tracking whether this week's activity decays the way a normal aftershock sequence would be expected to, smaller and smaller events tapering off over the coming days and weeks, or whether it instead continues producing additional moderate earthquakes in a pattern that would push it from routine background seismicity into the kind of genuinely concerning escalation Burns specifically flagged as the threshold worth watching for, multiple magnitude 4, 0, or larger events striking in relatively quick succession along the same stretch of fault. On the broader San Andreas research side, the scientific community will be watching closely for Bliznik's formal presentation and eventual peer-reviewed publication, since independent researchers examining her methodology and data firsthand will help determine how confidently her specific 10,000-year slip rate findings should be incorporated into official regional seismic hazard models going forward. Models that directly inform building codes, insurance risk assessments, and public earthquake preparedness guidance across the entire Bay Area. Neither of these threads offers any indication of exactly when a major earthquake might occur, and no credible scientist involved in either story has claimed otherwise. Earthquake prediction in that specific precise sense remains genuinely beyond current scientific capability, a limitation the USGS itself states plainly on its own public guidance. What both developments genuinely offer instead is a more accurate, more current picture of the underlying risk landscape Bay Area residents are already living within, refined by real data rather than by assumption. None of this should be read as cause for panic. And it's worth being explicit about that, since the distinction between taking a genuine risk seriously and reacting with unwarranted alarm matters enormously in how people actually respond to information like this. What it should be read as is a solid evidence-based reminder that basic earthquake preparedness is worth maintaining continuously, not just in the days immediately following a swarm that happens to make headlines. California's Shake Alert early warning system, despite this week's specific example of an earthquake falling just below its automatic public notification threshold, remains a genuinely valuable tool overall. And downloading the MyShake app or confirming your notification settings are properly configured takes only a few minutes. Knowing where your home's gas shutoff valve is located, keeping a basic emergency kit stocked with water, food, a flashlight, and any necessary medications, securing heavy furniture and water heaters to prevent them from toppling during strong shaking, and having an actual communication plan worked out with family members for a scenario where cell networks become overwhelmed are all steps that take relatively little time to set up, but can make a genuine difference in how the first chaotic hours after a major earthquake actually unfold. Bliznik's own insurance analogy captures this reasoning about as clearly as anything else could. Nobody wants to actually need an emergency kit, but having one prepared costs very little compared to the very real value it provides in the specific moment when it turns out to actually be needed. It's also worth understanding what modern earthquake response actually looks like in practice, since it's genuinely more sophisticated than most people outside the field tend to assume. When an earthquake like this week's swarm occurs, the response isn't limited to the initial automated magnitude estimate and public notification. USGS seismologists continue refining the location, depth, and magnitude of every significant event for hours and sometimes days afterward, as additional seismic station data comes in from across the region, which is exactly the process that took this week's initial 4.1 reading down to a final, more accurate 3.8. That same network of instruments also feeds directly into the broader hazard models researchers use to update regional earthquake forecasts, meaning that every swarm, every moderate earthquake, and every piece of new geological research, like Blisnick's slip rate study, incrementally sharpens the overall picture scientists have of where and how frequently major ruptures are likely to occur across the state. None of that turns earthquake forecasting into anything resembling prediction and the way weather forecasting can predict tomorrow's rain. The fundamental unpredictability of exactly when a specific fault will rupture remains a genuine and for now permanent limitation of the science. But the picture surrounding that unpredictability keeps getting measurably more detailed and more accurate with each new data point. And that steady incremental improvement is precisely what both this week's swarm and Blizzik's new research actually represent. Not a sudden new danger appearing out of nowhere, but a clearer view of a risk that has always been there. We will keep tracking both of these developing stories closely, watching how this week's Hayward Fault activity continues to evolve over the coming days, and following Blizzik's research as it moves toward formal peer review and publication later this year. If you want to stay ahead of how this actually develops rather than catching only the most dramatic headline versions of it later, go ahead and subscribe now and drop a comment telling us whether you think the Bay Area's aging earthquake preparedness infrastructure is keeping pace with what scientists are now learning about the underlying risk. Because that's a genuinely open and important question worth discussing given everything covered here.